Let's break down every single quarterback and every single tight end for every matchup of week 3 of 2024 fantasy football and go over who you should be starting and who you should be sitting. Before we do so, let me remind you guys that Underdog is the place to be if you want to get in on additional fantasy football action all season long. Their week 3 pick'ems are already going live. And if you want to claim a free pick'em for Thursday Night Football, Aaron Rodgers over half of a total yard to pair with any other week 3 Underdog pick'em, you can claim that by using promo code TheCatch when you sign up. That promo link is down below. And don't worry, if you watch the video later in the week, you will still get a free pick'em. And on top of that, you guys are going to receive a 50% deposit match up to $1,000 on Underdog when you use that promo code TheCatch. That's up to $1,000 in bonus cash on Underdog, plus that free pick'em when you use promo code TheCatch. All right, let's roll right into Thursday Night Football and take a look at the Patriots facing off against the Jets. And my oh my, I don't like this matchup very much for fantasy football at these two positions. I'm going to sit Jacoby Brissett, who improved from week 1 to week 2, going from 8 fantasy points to 12.6. Still has only thrown 1 touchdown on the season. I will say Jacoby Brissett has not turned the football over yet on the season, so kudos to him for that. But yeah, this is just a low ceiling offense. We don't need to discuss it. Even in deep formats or dynasty or super flex formats, like, you're not considering Jacoby Brissett this week. Hunter Henry, on the other hand, showed up in week 2. He's one of these tight ends who I do think you should pick up off the waiver wire. I mean, the tight end position has been an absolute wasteland to start the season, and he's sitting as the tight end 5. So, I mean, even with 3.8 fantasy points in week 1, he's coming in as a tight end 5 at the time of recording this. So I do think he's going to require another high target share on a weekly basis to have value or a touchdown. 18.9 fantasy points in week 2 and 12 targets, 109 receiving yards is hard to ignore. So if you're hurting at the position, then sure, you can go, maybe you're dealing with the David Njoku or Jake Ferguson injury, Evan Ingram, whatever, then sure, Hunter Henry can be started this week, but I just don't feel ultimately too fantastic about it because I don't know. I've picked up Hunter Henry and started him before. He was really good to start last season, for example, and then kind of was very, very up and down after that. So looking at the options, Henry's okay, but I'm going to leave it as just okay. All right, Aaron Rodgers had 11.5 fantasy points in week 1, then was better in week 2 on the road against Tennessee with 19.1 fantasy points and did throw 2 touchdowns, but only threw for 176 total yards. Rodgers, super flex, double quarterback, sure, you could roll him out there, but, this Patriots defense hasn't been necessarily bad to start the year. They haven't been necessarily great. Better in week 1 than they were in week 2. The Jets are at home. Rodgers is okay, but in single quarterback formats, I just don't see any reason to, consider him anything but a sit. Tyler Conklin has 2 targets and 1 reception in each game this year. No more than 2 fantasy points in each game this year. He is a sit for me. So Hunter Henry, if you're struggling at the position, fine. Aaron Rodgers, only a consideration in super flex double quarterback formats. Let's move along. All right, this will bring us to the Giants facing off against the Browns and Danny Dimes. Let's hand it to him. 22 fantasy points in week 2, but that was against the worst defense in the whole NFL and the Washington Commanders. 2 passing touchdowns, 32 yards on the ground, 16 of 28, no turnovers. But I don't know if that's going to be the story against the Browns in week 2. The Browns defense, a little shaky to start the year, but much better than the Commanders. So I'm going to say Daniel Jones is a sit unless you were wildly, wildly desperate in a double quarterback super flex format. But just don't forget the 2 interceptions, 5 sacks, and 186 passing yards, 6.9 fantasy points in week 1. Okay, Theo Johnson is really the only tight end to take a look at here. I guess, but we're not starting him. The tight end position has just seen little to no involvement on the season so far. We have a total of 5 combined targets to Theo Johnson, Daniel Bellinger, and Chris Manhertz, the only tight ends on this offense. So let's stay away from all Giants tight ends. Now, David Njoku missed week 2. Is he going to play week 3 at the time of recording this? I don't know. The Browns have not ruled him out for week 3 yet. So if he plays, I think you can still start David Njoku. That's fine. Jordan Atkins was looking like a potential last minute waiver wire ad if you had Evan Engram or Jake Ferguson or something and you were desperate, but he just had 1 target, 1 reception. So Jordan Atkins, I'm going to stay away from. We don't even know if he's going to be relevant this week. If Njoku plays, we're not even talking about Atkins. So Njoku, let's wait and see what happens. And either way, I don't think Atkins is going to be a start. Deshaun Watson was bad in week 1. He was better in week 2. He ran for a touchdown. He didn't throw 2 picks or fumble, but he still had just 15 fantasy points. So, it is a decent matchup here against the Giants. And I will say the Browns will face the Giants, the Raiders, the Commanders, Eagles, and the Bengals. So they're definitely going to have some opportunities over the next couple of weeks. We might see 1 or 2 actually decent performances from Watson. So I will say, I think in a Superflex double quarterback format, if you're desperate, you could start Deshaun Watson, but I'm not going to go out of my way to do so. And for the most part, Watson's still going to be a sit for me moving into week 3. All right, next up we have the Eagles traveling to face the Saints, and at the time of recording this, Monday Night Football has not been played yet, so unless we see a major injury or something wild, we're still starting Jalen Hurts in week 3. It doesn't really matter. You just have to start Jalen Hurts. The upside is way too high. I don't think we really need to discuss it, and maybe we see a concerning stat line of Dallas Goedert, but as long as he's healthy, I think that he's one of these guys you're probably just starting on a weekly basis and hoping for a touchdown. The floor isn't great, but it's not nearly as bad as some of the tight ends that we've seen so far on the season. 7.1 fantasy points in week 1. Maybe it's better in week 2. Maybe it's worse. But for the most part, I think you're rolling Goddard out there if you own him and you don't have better options. Looking at the Saints, man, oh man, your quarterback 2 in fantasy football is Derek Carr at the time I'm recording this. So 27 points in week 1. 26 in week 2, 5 total touchdowns on the season. 6 total touchdowns because he had the rushing touchdown as well. Derek Carr has been elevated to a start till further notice. We're going to have to see some poor stat lines until we consider benching Derek Carr. So, yes, Carr against the Eagles. I am fine with this Eagles secondary week. Carr should have an opportunity here to once again have a solid stat line in week 3. As far as the tight end room for the Saints, I'm staying away from everybody. I'm not touching any of these guys with a 10-foot pole. Even Taysom Hill, 4.6 points in week 1, 2.9 in week 2. We're seeing the Saints kind of fire on all cylinders, but Taysom Hill has not been a thing. Foster Moreau had a touchdown in week 1. He had 0 fantasy points in week 2. Jawan Johnson had a touchdown in week 1. He had 0 fantasy points in week 2. It's way too volatile. You're going to see guys do things at points, especially if the Saints offense keeps it up. But I'm staying away from all the Saints tight ends. Everyone else in this matchup, I think, is just fine moving into week 3. All right, next up, let's take a look at the Texans traveling to face the Vikings, and we're going to continue to consider CJ Stroud a start on a week in, week out basis. And listen, 16.3 fantasy points doesn't feel so good. The Bears defense was okay against Stroud. There's some, turnovers offensively in this game. Cam Akers fumbled, all that stuff. It was a closer game, and the offense looked good, especially early, and then there's kind of a little bit of back and forth game there. But Stroud, only averaged 18.6 fantasy points in his rookie season. So it was a QB 11 and was very good. And right now, at the time recording this, sits at the QB 10. But he's going to have a couple of these games throughout the year where maybe he doesn't get you 20-plus fantasy points or 18-plus fantasy points, and he sits around that 16 fantasy point mark. So Stroud, I think, is okay. I still think he's just a player where you drafted him, you have to consider him a start. The Vikings defense is kind of up and down through the first 2 games. They're certainly not bad. And they were pretty good against Brock Purdy in week 2. So at the end of the day, I still think that Stroud is just a player we're going to start. Don't want to underestimate the Vikings defense. That's looked good, but I still think Stroud is a good start. So Dalton Schultz, I got in the category, and I'll be honest, he probably needs to be downgraded to the sit category, but I think with all these injuries mounting up, how bad tight ends have been, I think you could throw Schultz out there and cross your fingers he scores a touchdown, but I just don't know with all these Texans wide receivers what the touchdown upside is going to look like for Dalton Schultz on the season, especially assuming that Joe Mixon is healthy. I think that Dalton Schultz might get downgraded to the sit category pretty soon. But if you're absolutely desperate, I think you could roll him out there and cross your fingers, and that's about as good as I think it'll get. Moving along to the Vikings, Sam Darnold should be rostered in all Superflex formats and all double quarterback formats. If he is not, he's sitting at 20% rostered at the moment, but I think that number refers to single quarterback leagues. If you are desperate at the quarterback position, you got to consider Sam Darnold. He's in the category, but he's a fringe He might get elevated to the start category pretty soon. 19 fantasy points in week 1, 24 in week 2. He's thrown 2 touchdowns in each game this year. He has thrown a pick in each game, but the reason why Darnold is closer to the category this week is because you still got JJ questionable. I think he's going to be fine. I think he's going to play. Then you also have Addison still questionable for the week, but there's a chance he plays in week 3, and Jalen Naylor has filled in nicely at the wide receiver position. But you got, this should be a good competitive game script, but you got your 2 primary wide receivers a little dinged up. So a little bit cautious on Darnold this week, but you can't ignore the production that Darnold has been putting up, and he needs to be higher up on the overall fantasy radar, even in single quarterback formats. And then you got Johnny Munt at tight end for the Vikings. He's had 3 targets and 2 receptions in each game this year. He's a sit, no fantasy value there. So this should be a good game overall that I'm looking forward to. Stroud, Darnold, the main guys we're paying attention to for the purpose of this video in this week 3 matchup. Moving along, we have the Bo Nix-led Broncos traveling to face the best quarterback in the league, Baker Mayfield's Buccaneers. And let's start with the Denver Broncos and Bo Nix. So not good in week 1, not good in week 2. He's thrown 4 picks on the year. He has 1 rushing touchdown, 0 passing touchdowns. I don't know that it's going to get much better in week 3 on the road against Tampa Bay. We'll say this Buccaneers defense hasn't necessarily been stout, but I don't have a lot of confidence here in Bo Nix, and I don't think you, the viewer who's watching this, does either. So we're sitting Bo Nix even in deep formats. Greg Dulcich did have 8 targets in week 2, but just 4.6 fantasy points. Not enough here. Greg Dulcich is not going anywhere near my starting lineup or your starting lineup. All right, Baker Moneymaker Mayfield. So Baker Mayfield was must-start quarterback in my mind going into week 1, a player I encourage you guys to start in week 1. And then at the end of week 1 going into the beginning of week 1, after the Thursday and Friday night game in the last-minute waiver video, told you guys, if you are kind of nervous about your quarterback, pick up Baker Mayfield and start him against the Commanders, where he had 37.6 fantasy points, and then in week 2 had 21.8 fantasy points against the Lions. And if you guys watched last week's last-minute waiver video, I told you guys, if Baker's still out there and you're nervous about your quarterback, same message. Start him in week 2. And once again, Baker was a must-start last week. And I still believe in this next 2 weeks against the Broncos and the Eagles, plenty of very good opportunity for Baker Mayfield, who at the moment is the QB1 in fantasy football, to continue to excel. Now, the time I'm recording this, Monday Night Football has not been played, like I said, so maybe Hurts moves up here in front of Mayfield or Derek Carr, but this is the simulation we're living in where Derek Carr and Baker Mayfield are the QBs 1 and 2 fantasy football at the time I'm recording this. So I will note once again, if Mayfield is out there, maybe a little bit nervous because like the stretch coming up also includes the Falcons, which we don't really know how to view them right now, the Saints, the Ravens, the Falcons, again, the Chiefs and Niners. But then after their bye week in week 11, the Bucs will get the Giants, the Panthers, the Raiders, Chargers. We'll see how that looks. Then the Cowboys and the Panthers. Again, I think Baker could be one of the best quarterbacks in the second half, final stretch of the season going into the fantasy playoffs. And he's already proven to be very valuable in the beginning of the year. So another Baker Mayfield rant, another week of fantasy football. Start Baker Mayfield. Stop doubting him. Then we got Cade Otton, who has done nothing this season. 4 targets, 1 reception. We're not starting him anytime soon. So mostly sits here in a nice Baker Mayfield rant. Let's move along. All right, let's take a look at the Packers traveling to face the Titans. And this is a little bit of a tough one to evaluate this early in the week because there's a chance that Jordan Love plays in week 3. I've read there's even a chance that he could have played in week 2. So I don't think that he's going to play in week 3 because I don't feel like this is really like, I don't know. They're 1-1. This is a pretty good opponent in terms of the Packers having a chance to win because Will Levis is the quarterback for the Titans. So I don't want to underestimate this Titans defense, which has been okay through the first 2 games, but I just don't know. Like, if Jordan Love plays, then yeah, you start Jordan Love, okay? If Malik Willis plays, let's hand it to Malik Willis. Credit, came out of that Colts matchup with the dub and didn't turn the football over at 41 yards on the ground, 6.8 yards per carry, threw a touchdown due to Dontavion Wicks. So hand it to him, but not enough in fantasy, 14.9 fantasy points. I'm still not ready to start Malik Willis. So, yeah, we got all sits here. Tucker Kraft, Luke Musgrave, not enough here. Kraft, I guess, is the tight end still to own. He still was on the field for a much higher percentage of snaps than Luke Musgrave in week 2. Still had 2 targets in week 2 compared to Musgrave's 1. So there's your in-depth breakdown on the Packers tight ends, but we're still not starting them. There's still not enough. And I think for them to see any value, we need a healthy Jordan Love. So as the week progresses, we'll see what happens. If Jordan Love plays, you can start him. If he does not play, then we're just going to go ahead and call Malik Willis a sit. Moving along to the Titans, Will Levis, my guy, it's not looking so good, okay? We got 3 picks, 2 lost fumbles through the first 2 games of the season, 2 passing touchdowns. He has averaged 9 yards or more per carry in the first 2 games. He's had 4 rushing attempts in each game. But if you guys are watching these games, you know that Will Levis has looked aggressively bad. So this Packers defense looked good in week 2, had 3 picks against Anthony Richardson. So I'm going to consider Will Levis a strong must sit. And then looking at the tight end position, Chicken Conco scored a touchdown in week 1. He had 3 targets in week 2. Josh Wild, 0 targets in week 1, 2 in week 2. Just not enough here from a fantasy perspective. Chicken Conco, maybe if you're seriously, ridiculously desperate in a 16-team league, you could cross your fingers for a touchdown, but I'm not going to bank on it in most of our starting lineups moving into week 3. All right, moving along, let's take a look at the Bears traveling to face the Colts. And Caleb Williams, has been downgraded each week in these videos. In week 1, I thought Bears at home, new era, that preseason hype, it all got to me after being, in respect to a lot of other, fantasy content creators, pretty dang low on Caleb Williams. I fed into some of the hype and I said, you know what, maybe Caleb, an okay start week 1. And then going into week 2, it was like, if you're desperate, I'll leave it up to you. If you only drafted Caleb Williams, you can give him one more shot, but I'm not feeling as confident. Now in week 3, I think we can all agree Caleb Williams is a sit. So 2 picks in week 2. Didn't have a turnover in week 1. He did fumble once. It was not a lost fumble. So there's 2 turnovers in week 2. 8.8 yards per carry. Was moving around a little bit there. Threw for 93 yards in week 1, 174 in week 2, 7.2 fantasy points in week 1, 9.3 in week 2. So, is all of this necessarily a product of Caleb Williams? No, because there's no run game right now for the Bears, and the offensive line looks like the worst offensive line in the league. And Caleb Williams, I think, I'm saying this off the top of my head, I think he dropped back 36 times and was pressured 35 times in week 2. So don't get me wrong, not all this is Caleb Williams' fault, but we can't ignore from a fantasy football perspective that we can't start Caleb Williams in any format right now. We just can't, unless you're tanking in a dynasty league, even come close to considering Caleb Williams. So he is a sit for me in week 3. Cole Kmet, 5 targets, better than the 1 target in week 1. He's still a set. Gerald Everett in week 2, 3 targets, better than the 1 target in week 1. He's also a set. We just can't. We're going to stay away from this Bears offense, probably outside of DJ Moore for the coming weeks. All right, moving along, we got the Colts. Anthony Richardson, a little bit of a head scratcher in week 2 after having 31 fantasy points in week 1. He threw 3 picks, ran for 37 yards, threw for 204 total yards, and a passing touchdown, 14.8 fantasy points. So, Rich, you just can't sit him. He's still going to be one of those guys where the upside's too high. He spent too high draft capital. He'll see better weeks. It's a little concerning in week 2, but, Anthony Richardson still only has a handful of starts in the NFL, and this is one of the knocks on Anthony Richardson is how well can he actually really throw the football. And now we're really left with a mixed review here, because week 1 he was slinging that football. I still think he had the best, that touchdown to Alec Pierce I think was the best throw in all of week 1 football. And then week 2 is like, what are you doing, Anthony Richardson? So the rushing upside's there, though. We still know he can throw the football. We saw it in week 1, so I'm going to go ahead and still start him for sure in week 3 against the Bears, and I think you guys would agree with that. Kylan Granson is still the starting tight end for the Colts, and he is still a sit moving into week 3. Let's move along. All right, next up we have the Chargers traveling to face the Steelers, and I've been very wary of Justin Herbert in fantasy football to start the season. And I just think that the ceiling is going to continue to be low in this run-first offense. And then, we had Herbert needing x-rays after week 2's matchup against the Panthers, which supposedly have come up negative, and like Herbert's going to be good to go week 3, but we still know that he's going to have that underlying foot injury at times bug him throughout the season. And now we have a right leg injury, which, like I said, has come up negative, so we're probably fine, but I still worry about, is Herbert going to be able to be super mobile this year against a team like the Steelers, who have a very strong front 7? So I still worry about Herbert's upside overall in fantasy on the season for multiple reasons, the injuries, and then this offensive system, the pass catchers, all that stuff. And now week 3 against the Steelers, Herbert's a sit for me unless you're desperate in a super flex double QB format. Then looking at the tight ends, Hayden Hurst, Will Dissly. Dissly 3 targets, Hurst 2 targets in week 2. There's just not enough. We're not starting either guy in any format as we approach the week. Now we have the Steelers and Justin Fields, another victory in week 2. Steelers are at the top of their respective division there. Russell Wilson was an emergency quarterback in week 2, although he was inactive. So what do we do moving into week 3? I think Fields is still going to be the starter. I guess there is a world where potentially Russell Wilson is named the starter here, but I think it's going to be Fields until further notice. And Fields did throw a touchdown in week 2, but he's still running the football, ran the football 8 times. He's had a fumble in each game. Neither of them have been lost. He's only taken 2 sacks in each game, not awful. He hasn't thrown for more than 156 passing yards in a game, and he hasn't had more than 13.3 fantasy points in a game. So I think the ceiling is very, very low. I think there's a potential that as each week goes on that Fields is the starting quarterback, maybe we see the system open up a little bit more and some things open up for Justin Fields to where he's okay in that category. But I can't put him past it. And even then, I think you could strongly say that Justin Fields should be a sit this week. But I don't know. I think maybe we see a week where he shows up, and gives us some of that fantasy value we've seen, which let me remind you, it was not that long ago. It wasn't like it's been 2 years. Like Fields last year in the last 4 games of the fantasy season went with 26 points, 13 points, 27 points, and 27 points again. Literally 27 or more fantasy points in the last 2, the semifinal and the championship last year. So hopefully we start to see the Steelers offense open up a bit more, but I don't know. It's Arthur Smith as offensive coordinator. Okay, moving along. Pat Freiermuth has 4 targets and 4 receptions in each game this year. So, I mean, compared to what's out there, I mean, he should probably be a start. I mean, he's the tight end 8 right now in fantasy football, but the ceiling's just so low. And I think if he was on any other team and giving you 6.7 and 7.9 points in weeks 1 and 2, maybe I'd just put him as a start. But it's like in this Arthur Smith offense, he's still an because I don't know how many touchdowns we're going to see out of the Steelers this year. And then this is a bit of a tough matchup here. I think that the Chargers-Steelers are going to allow for a low-scoring defensive game. Darnell Washington had a touchdown in week 2, but he's had just 1 target and 1 reception each game this year. The ceiling's far too low for Washington, so he's a sit. See what happens, but I think this is going to be kind of a nitty-gritty, not-so-good game for fantasy in week 3. All right, next up, let's take a look at the Dolphins traveling to face the Seahawks. And at the time of recording this, we don't know, is Tua going to be headed to IR? Is he going to play this year? Is he going to play later in the year? Is he going to play week 3? Everything's up in the air. So I think most of us would agree Tua's probably not playing week 3 is pretty safe to say, which is going to lead us to Skylar Thompson as the starting quarterback in week 3. If Tua does play, I'm probably still sitting him. I just don't feel great about it, but you can definitely consider him if you have to, and he plays in week 3. But like I said, I think everyone's best educated guess, if they were in my shoes right now, is that Tua's not going to play. So certainly wishing Tua a swift and healthy recovery and all the time he needs to make decisions about his future in the NFL. But from a fantasy perspective, I just don't think Tua or Skylar Thompson are going to be options this week. So I think we can move along. I don't think we really need to break down Skylar Thompson. I did it the other night on a live stream, and it's pretty bad. So we can move along there. And they did sign Tyler Huntley, so maybe he ends up being the starter. I don't know, but let's just move along. Jonnu Smith was okay in week 2. Actually got pretty involved and is currently, at the time of recording this, a tight end 11 in fantasy football, but 7 targets, 6 receptions, 53 receiving yards, 8.8 yards per catch. Worth noting, in 1 catch in week 1, 7 yards per catch, so that's been pretty good on the season. 11.3 fantasy points, but yeah, I just don't feel good about this offense. Like, you got some studs in this offense at wide receiver and running back you have to start, but guys like Jonnu Smith, I'm just not touching right now, and I think you guys would agree. Let's move along to Geno Smith, who I've been a little harsh on in the start-sit videos to start the year, but he had 20.8 fantasy points in week 1, 19.8 in week 2. I think he's fine. Yeah, you can start him. Why not? And actually, he was pretty close to being a true start going into this matchup because this Dolphins defense has been pretty dang bad through the first 2 weeks of the season. But I just kind of get left, I think on a lot of rosters thinking that a lot of you guys probably don't need to start Geno Smith. But the injuries mounting up, I think Geno Smith is an okay start for sure this week because the matchup is good. So, the Seahawks will play the Dolphins, the Lions, and the Giants in the coming weeks. I think we could definitely continue to see a solid floor out of Geno Smith over the next couple weeks. Don't know how high the ceiling has been, but quarterback play across fantasy hasn't been fantastic this year anyways. So Geno Smith, fringe start player, maybe unfair to not put him in the start category at the time. But like I said, I just don't know that you're going to be like in a position where you have to start him this week. So he's in the category, but if you're desperate, I think he could end up being a solid start this week for sure. That brings us to Noah Fant, who is just one of those names in the offseason that, we talk about and we hope for, and then ends up when it comes time for the actual season, he just does nothing. 4 targets week 1, 3 in week 2, no more than 3.1 fantasy points in a matchup this year so far. So Noah Fant is a sit. And my, oh my, that brings us to the highly anticipated matchup between the Andy Dalton-led Panthers and the Gardner Minshew-led Raiders. So Bryce Young is not going to be the starter for the Panthers. Early Monday, it was announced that Andy Dalton will be starting for the Panthers. So what does this mean from a fantasy perspective against a defense like the Raiders, who not been very good to start the year, and looking at an offense that's been in complete shambles when it comes to the Carolina Panthers? So Andy Dalton, am I going to start him? No. He did start one game last year at Seattle and had 23.5 fantasy points. So listen, this is the right decision for the organization. They need to evaluate the rest of this roster. It's not even fair to really have Bryce Young out there starting right now. He's just not a starting caliber quarterback in the NFL. 3 picks through the first 2 weeks, 6 sacks through the first 2 weeks. He did have that rushing touchdown in week 1. But I mean, if you're watching these games, like, you can just see it. Bryce Young should not be the starting quarterback for the Panthers right now. So regardless of how you feel about the situation, I don't think we can have any confidence in starting Andy Dalton. You'd have to be like, you drafted Jordan Love and Tua in a super flex league, and all your opponents are rostering all the waiver wire quarterbacks to even consider Andy Dalton. I'm not saying he's going to be awful necessarily, but I don't have any faith in our starting lineups here in week 3 to start him. And I don't have any faith in Jatavion Sanders as well as Tommy Tremble. Tremble 4 targets in week 2, didn't play in week 1, then Sanders 2 targets in week 2. Not enough fantasy value there whatsoever. Now, a tight end who certainly has had lots of fantasy value in his rookie season is Brock Bowers, currently sitting at the tight end 2 at the time of recording this. 11.8 fantasy points in week 1, 18.8 in week 2. Had 9 targets, 9 receptions in week 2, 98 receiving yards. Like I said, 18 fantasy points. Bowers has looked good. They're finding ways to get him the football. Him and Gardner Minshew are meshing. Overall, Brock Bowers is going to continue to be a start on a week in, week out basis until further notice. His co-tight end, Michael Mayer, is going to continue to be a sit. 1 reception in week 2, 2 receptions in week 1. We're not touching Michael Mayer anytime soon. Harrison Bryant had 1 target in week 2. This is the Brock Bowers show at tight end. No one else to even consider. Gardner Minshew, on the other hand, we're not considering either. I mean, I say it every video, love me some Gardner Minshew. I would do anything to spend a whole day with Gardner Minshew. 11.7 fantasy points in week 1, 13.9 in week 2. Pick in both games, a fumble in both games. 1 passing touchdown each game. Sorry, Minshew. We're not starting you in fantasy football anytime soon. Moving along, we will have the Niners squaring off against the Rams. And this will be an interesting matchup. Brock Purdy has not been very good through the first 2 games of the season from a fantasy standpoint. He's only thrown 1 touchdown. And in week 2 against Minnesota, that Vikings defense kind of humming. He threw a pick and he lost a fumble. Did have 319 passing yards, but I'm still going to put Purdy as a start, and mainly because I think we can have some confidence because this Rams defense was really bad in week 2 against the Cardinals, and this should be a good kind of get-right type game for the Niners offense and their quarterback position and their pass catchers, not named Deebo Samuel or George Kittle, so basically Purdy and Ayuk. But, yeah, I think Purdy will have a fine week this week. He's a solid start with this matchup, and Kittle, I think you're basically getting the Kittle experience if you drafted him. 8 points in week 1. Not awful compared to most tight ends out there, but in week 2 had the touchdown, 76 receiving yards, 8 targets, 7 receptions, and 20.6 fantasy points. So you own Kittle, you start him, you take what you get. Week 2, you were happy. Week 1, maybe not as happy. In week 3, you'll find out, but it'll probably be just fine. Kittle is still a start. Now, Stafford gets downgraded this week to a sit. I liked him going into week 2. I expected more out of that matchup, but now this offense is in shambles with the Cooper Kupp injury. Cooper Kupp is expected to miss several weeks and potentially hit the IR. So now you have Kupp and Puka Nacua on IR. And there are talented wide receivers on this team, but none nearly as talented as those two guys that we just named. So Stafford against the Niners defense with a depleted wide receiver room and a bad offensive line that's also depleted. Very worried about staph infection, not starting him this week, even in double quarterback formats. Colby Parkinson, I'm kind of on. And, week 2, the game script just blew everything away. The injuries blew everything away. This is a fresh start in week 3 because the thesis in week 2 was Puka's gone. Maybe Parkinson, who had 5 targets in week 1, sees more volume. But everything got away from the Rams in week 2, and he walked away with just 2 targets, 1 reception, 2.2 fantasy points. So I was pretty close just putting Parkinson as a sit. But I think there's a world where if you're absolutely desperate, maybe this week he is a bigger part of the game plan, and he does benefit from the Puka and Cooper Kupp injuries. So Colby Parkinson, a pure desperation stream. Maybe should have put something other than the but he's basically in the category this week, and I don't feel so great about him, but there is an opportunity once again in week 3 if you're desperate enough at the tight end position. Moving along, we have the Lions traveling to face the Cardinals, and Sam Laporta, a little concerning right now. You've probably spent a 2nd, 3rd, or 4th round draft pick on him, depending on your league size, format, all that good stuff. And he's had just 6 catches through the first 2 games of the season and just 8 targets. But I think Laporta is going to be fine. I think the big issue for him is that Jameson Williams is a true wide receiver 2, and you're still seeing a lot of usage in the passing game to Jahmyr Gibbs, who had 6 targets in week 1 and 7 in week 2. And although we saw Gibbs very involved in the passing game last year, it certainly wasn't as consistent as what we're at least seeing to start the year this year. And even Monty had 4 targets last week. So, and on top of that, Amon-Ra St. Brown came in with a whopping 19 targets. So Laporta's usage kind of iffy here. There's concern, don't get me wrong. But let's keep Laporta in our starting lineups for now. I mean, he's still at 8.5 fantasy points in week 1, 11.2 yards per catch. Not great, but once again, you look at the tight end landscape right now, it's not awful. So Laporta, I'm going to keep him in lineups in week 3, but I am concerned. I'll put it that way. Jared Goff has been downgraded to the category. I liked him a lot in week 1. I liked him again in week 2. The matchups were there. The game scripts were there. And 10 fantasy points in week 2, 15 in week 1. So threw for 307 passing yards in week 2, but didn't throw any touchdowns, didn't rush for any touchdowns, and had 2 picks. He also had a pick in week 1. So I'm a little concerned about him, but also this Lions team's just going to run the football first. 3 combined touchdowns between Gibbs and Monty to start the year. I'm worried about Goff. It's a good matchup, although the Cardinals look better in week 2 defensively than they did in week 1. But yeah, Goff has got to be like you're desperate in a super flex double quarterback league. If you drafted him in a single quarterback league, you're looking to guys like Baker Mayfield and Derek Carr for the time being. Moving along to the Cardinals, Kyler Murray, man, oh man, I did like him going into week 2, and I think really regardless, Kyler's going to be a must start on a week in, week out basis, just based on where you drafted him, But yeah, now we have a ceiling of 31.5 fantasy points for Kyler, and he had 14.1 fantasy points in week 1, and he only rushed for 2 more yards in week 2 than he did in week 1, 59 to 57, and he finished with 31.5 fantasy points in week 2 because he threw 3 touchdowns. And if this game was competitive in any way in week 2, I mean, we could have seen a massive ceiling for Kyler Murray. So Kyler, regardless of matchup, is just going to be a quarterback 1 as we approach the rest of the season, as long as he's healthy. So yes, we are keeping Kyler Murray after a massive performance in our starting lineups, but you're pretty happy as a Kyler Murray, owner, but arguably, Trey McBride owners are even happier because he went from 8 points in week 1 to 18.7 fantasy points in week 2. And this is another tight end similar to Sam Laporta that you spent heavy, high draft capital on. So 6 targets, 6 receptions, 67 receiving yards for Trey McBride, 11.1 yards per catch. 8 fantasy points, once again, compared to the tight end landscape in week 1 is not that bad, but week 2 was definitely encouraging to see. The Cardinals are going to play the Lions, the Commanders, the Niners, the Packers, and the Chargers in the next coming weeks. We're going to get a good blend of weak defenses, good game scripts, all that stuff to really get a good fantasy evaluation on all the Cardinals players. So for the time being, Kyler Murray, Trey McBride are certainly staying in starting lineups. All right, next up we will have the Ravens traveling to face the Cowboys, and this is a tough one to take a look at. Lamar Jackson, I mean, we're still keeping him in our starting lineups. It was rougher in week 2 than in week 1. This Ravens team is 0-2. But Lamar Jackson has to be a starting quarterback in fantasy no matter what. He still had 17.3 fantasy points in week 2. He's fine. The upside's high. If you drafted him, you were still starting him. We don't need to spend a lot of time on it. Mark Andrews, better in week 2 than in week 1. Isaiah Likely, worse in week 2, to say the least, than compared to week 1. So I still think you're going to start both of these guys. I was close to putting Andrews and or Likely in the category, but the way the Cowboys played in week 1, although they didn't give up hardly any points to the tight end position, I am going to go and leave Andrews and or Likely as starts. Andrews, I think, is the floor play. Likely is the upside play that comes with a lot of risk looking at the first 2 weeks of the season. So I'm okay with starting either guy, but you got to be okay if you walk away with 3.4 points like you did with Andrews in week 1, or 4.6 points like you did with Likely in week 2. As far as the Cowboys go, I've got everyone just as a Dak Prescott, 17.9 fantasy points in week 2. Better than week 1 where he had 11.4 fantasy points, but he also threw 2 picks and had a fumble in week 2. So the Saints were, walking all over the Cowboys. They were at home, and now they're at home again week 3 against the Ravens. So I'm a little bit wishy-washy on what I want to do with Prescott this week. I think if you own him for the most part, you're probably still starting him and hoping for like a floor of, 17, 18 fantasy points. But I'm just kind of confused about how I feel about this Cowboys offense at this time in the season. So Prescott's fine. It depends on if you have another player on your roster that is potentially a little bit better, or gives you more upside. I know a lot of people who drafted Prescott drafted a second quarterback, like maybe Jaden Daniels late or something like that. So just depends. Or maybe you've picked up a guy like Baker or Derek Carr after a week 1 poor performance out of Prescott. Now, at the time of recording this, we don't know if Jake Ferguson's playing in week 3. He missed week 2 with that knee injury. He's expected to play week 3, but you never know. It's the NFL, and the way things are going, I just don't know. So Luke Schoonmaker was a name that came up last week that I told you guys if you need someone last second, you can pick him up, plug him in, cross your fingers. He delivered 6 targets, 6 receptions, 43 receiving yards, 10.3 fantasy points. So most weeks for me, Ferguson would just be a start, but Cowboys in a weird spot right now. Dak hasn't been playing fantastic. Ferguson's coming off an injury. So whoever is healthy at tight end and is deemed the starter, I think, is in the category. If you're desperate, you can certainly start them. It depends. Like if you're going into week 3 and Ferguson was your tight end 1, who's your tight end 2 now? Did you grab Isaiah Likely off the waivers? Did you have to go with a desperation guy? It just kind of depends. Don't feel fantastic about the Cowboys quarterback and Dak Prescott or the tight ends this week, but they're certainly all startable in the right circumstances. Moving along, we will have the Chiefs traveling to face the Falcons. Once again, at the time of recording this, Monday Night Football has not been played, so I don't know how Captain Kirk O'Chains and Kyle Pitts are going to look in terms of this evaluation, but let's start with the Chiefs here. And I'm still starting Mahomes, 16 fantasy points in week 1, 14 in week 2. An interception in week 1, 2 interceptions in week 2. And I'm still starting Kelsey. Once again, another player here where there's a little bit of concern, to say the least. 4 targets in week 1, 3 in week 2, and just 4 total targets on the season. 6.4 points in week 1, 1.6 in week 2. So I'm concerned about Kelsey. He seems to be kind of struggling this year. They're not looking like they're getting him super heavily involved. Maybe the Isaiah Pacheco injury will help Kelsey. Maybe they're trying to preserve him a bit as the season goes on, assuming they're going to make a playoff push. Also concerned a little bit about Mahomes, but once again, maybe the Pacheco injury helps here, and they're just forced to throw the football, open things up a bit more. So certainly close to considering Mahomes and Kelsey, close to the category, but I'm going to trust these two guys and keep them in our starting lineups, and I'm definitely going to trust Mahomes for the time being. I'm more concerned about Kelsey, if anything, but I'm going to leave them in the start category. We'll have a conversation next week if these guys are still playing at a low ceiling after week 3. Then at the tight end position, I'm going to leave Kyle Pitts as a start, but he's kind of a fringe start. It depends on how things look in the Monday night's matchup, right? So by the time you guys are watching this, we'll have a better evaluation and we'll know. But time of recording this, we don't quite know. And I will say in week 1, 11.6 fantasy points, but you take away the touchdown grab, does not finish the day with a good fantasy stat line whatsoever. Just 3 targets and 3 receptions on the day. So that touchdown was certainly valuable. Gets the Eagles in week 2, then obviously the Chiefs in week 3. He's probably a tight end that you're rolling out there each week, crossing your fingers unless we see a pattern emerge that's way too concerning. Looking at Kirk Cousins, a bad week 1. Verdict's out at the time of recording this, like I said, for week 2. I think for the most part, against the Chiefs defense, I'm going to look to sit Kirk Cousins. I don't think a lot of you guys are in a situation where you need to start him. Maybe in Superflex, maybe in a double quarterback format if he plays good enough against the Eagles, which I certainly think there's an opportunity to against that Eagles secondary for him to have a good stat line. So I'm going to leave him as a sit, see what happens in week 2. But I think for the most part, I don't really want to start Kirk Cousins approaching week 3. All right, moving along to Sunday Night Football, we'll have the Jaguars traveling to face the Buffalo Bills. And what do we do with Trevor Lawrence? Beautiful hair, not beautiful fantasy stat lines as of late. 11.2 fantasy points in week 1, then just 13.3 in week 2. This offense looks lost. They look uninspired. I'm really worried. You know, if you spent draft capital on most of the Jaguars offensive players, maybe outside of Travis Etienne right now. So I have downgraded Trevor Lawrence to the sit category officially. I actually don't remember. I think last week he may have been in the category, may have been a start, may have given him one last chance, but he's now officially in the sit category until further notice. Evan Ingram missed week 2 last second because this is 2024 fantasy football and these are the things that happen. But I mean, he's another guy who did not look like a fantasy starter in week 1 with just 1 reception off of 4 targets. So I think if Ingram plays, you know, we can start Evan Ingram because he's still been a top 5 fantasy tight end in the past 2 seasons. But the concern is there, like I said, for nearly every Jaguars offensive starter. Brenton Strange had 6 targets, 3 receptions, 9.5 fantasy points in week 2. But, you know, he's only a guy we can consider if Ingram misses week 3 again. So if Ingram plays week 3, we'll start him. If Brenton Strange plays, you'd have to be really desperate. I'm probably just going to leave him as a sit. Now, moving along to the Bills, Josh Allen, just 9.7 fantasy points in week 2. I am still going to start Josh Allen on a weekly basis. Now, the game script did not benefit Josh Allen. The Bills were far ahead. Their defense was balling. James Cook was balling. He threw 1 touchdown. He didn't really do anything wrong in this game. It just didn't equate to a good fantasy stat line. Don't forget he had 31 fantasy points in week 1. Don't be afraid if you own Josh Allen. This is a good home matchup for the Bills and Josh Allen. Bad fantasy performance, but still an absolute stud at the end of the day. I'm going to move to the tight end position here for the Bills. Dalton Kincaid better in week 2. Certainly could have been much better if the game script didn't get away from them. 7 fantasy points, 4 targets, 4 receptions. I'm going to keep Kincaid in the start category. I know you spent high draft capital on him. We didn't see a rewarding week 2 necessarily, but at least it was better than week 1. I will say Dawson Knox has been on the field quite a bit. Was on the field for 53% of snaps in week 2, 58% in week 1. But we kind of have two tough games to evaluate here. Cardinals, you know, they were behind and then came back and won that game. The Dolphins, they were just ahead. So I'm not going to read too much into it yet, but it is worth, noting. And no, we're not starting Dawson Knox in fantasy football anytime soon. All right, that brings us to our final matchup of the week. We're going to take a look at the Washington Commanders traveling to face the Cincinnati Bengals. And Jaden Daniels, 28 fantasy points in week 1, just 13.4 in week 2. So how do we feel about him on the road in week 3? I'm going to leave him in the start category. Still ran the football effectively in week 2 and looked better throwing the football, was 23 of 29. The problem is this Commanders offense just isn't really finding the end zone. They were in the red zone a lot, but all they did was kick field goals on Sunday. So there's concern here. This is still a rookie quarterback, but he's certainly more inspiring than maybe some of the other rookie quarterbacks, if not all the other rookie quarterbacks out there from a fantasy perspective, because he gets it done on the ground. So, had 2 rushing touchdowns in week 1, then none in week 2, and that's certainly not promising when they were going up against the Giants defense. But I think for the time being, Jaden Daniels is staying in starting lineups unless you have someone else that you feel more confident in. But Daniels, a good start here on the road. Zach Ertz hits the category. I think he's a player you can pick up, you can plug in if you don't have anything better. That was my belief going into week 2, and he did actually perform, and in full PPR have 10.2 fantasy points, 4 targets, 4 receptions, 62 receiving yards. So I like Zach Ertz. If you're desperate, you don't have anything better, he certainly provides a safe enough floor that he's going to potentially get you through the week, and definitely cross your fingers for a touchdown to elevate that stat line. Ben Sennett, John Bates, Colson Yankoff. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but they all combined for 1 total target. Zach Ertz is the tight end to own in terms of the Washington Commanders. Moving along to the Cincinnati Bengals. Joe Burrow looked better in week 2, gave you 17.2 fantasy points compared to 8.06 in week 1, threw 2 touchdowns, did have 2 fumbles and a lost fumble, 258 passing yards, 23 of 36. I mean, if you watch the game, Burrow looked much better, much more confident, much more comfortable. So there's still problems with this Bengals offense for sure, but they kept it competitive against the former Super Bowl champs on the road in Arrowhead. And I think Burrow, we can have confidence in at home against the Washington Commanders defense for sure. So Burrow, a strong must-start quarterback this week. And next week, might be on the road, but he gets the Panthers. Burrow's going to be starting in a comfortable start in week 3 and week 4. And I'm so confident in Burrow this week that I would head straight to Underdog and hit the over on his passing yards. And don't forget, if you are new to Underdog, you can claim a free pick'em for the week with promo code The Catch. Go ahead and take that free pick'em, pair it with Joe Burrow's over on the passing yards to triple your entry. And while you're at it, you're going to get a 50% deposit match up to $1,000 on Underdog when you use promo code The Catch. That's up to $1,000 in bonus cash on Underdog, plus that free pick'em to pair with a great line like Joe Burrow's over on the passing yards for week 3 when you use promo code The Catch. Mike Gesicki, if you're desperate at tight end, he hits the category, but Ertz and Gesicki might be 2 of the top waiver additions at tight end moving into the week. Gesicki, 9 targets, 7 receptions, 91 receiving yards, led the team in receiving this past Sunday against the Chiefs, 16.1 fantasy points. Once again, gets the Commanders, gets the Panthers. Gesicki should be on the streaming radar for sure for the tight end position, and definitely has some value potentially as the rest of the season progresses. So like both quarterbacks in this matchup, and if you need a tight end, I think both tight ends will be solid in this Monday Night Football matchup as well. And that'll do it for today's video. Don't forget, if you have any fantasy football questions whatsoever, to drop them in the comment section down below. I will answer every single comment on this video before Thursday Night Football, as well as before all of Sunday's games go underway. And don't forget, we will have every single thing you guys need throughout the entire week for week 3 fantasy football. Start sits at every single position. We already have our must-start defenses as well as our early waiver wire video out. Must-start kickers will go live later today. Our buy low candidates for the week will go live tomorrow. And our wide receivers and running backs that will dominate week 3 fantasy football will be going live, as well as our last-minute waiver wire video on Saturday and our week 3 early morning breakdown on Sunday, as well as fantasy Q&A live streams throughout the whole week. So make sure you guys are subscribed so we can help you do whatever we can to take home a victory in week 3. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.